While Buffalo Bill put tales of the heroic West on parade, a young professor came down to the World's Fair with a new way to tell the same sort of story, but with data. Frederick Jackson Turner from the fledgling University of Wisconsin presented his thoughts to the American Historical Association. His thesis would come to be called the single most influential piece of writing in the history of American history.
Turner starts this famous essay by quoting the Census Bureau, which interestingly in 1890 declares for the first time that there is no longer a visible frontier line on the demographic maps that the census is producing. Up until that time, if you drew a map of where people were and were not living in the United States and drew a line in areas that had more than 2 people per square mile or less than 2 people per square mile, there was a very clear demarcation between those two.
From 1790 on, that line had been moving steadily westward. Thomas Jefferson had speculated that to fill the vast open spaces of America, it would take 100 generations. It took about 80 years. By 1890, people had settled throughout the Western territories, and a clear frontier line could no longer be drawn.
Turner sees those maps and says, wait a second, something important is happening here. Something radical is changing in the nature of the American experience. The frontier line is ending, and therefore the first chapter of American history has come to a close.
Turner believed that creating a nation out of the wilderness yielded character traits that were unique to Americans.
Coarseness and strength, acuteness and inquisitiveness, that restless, nervous energy, that dominant individualism which comes with freedom. These are the traits of the frontier. This expansion westward with its new opportunities, its continuous touch with the simplicity of primitive society, furnishes the forces dominating American character. Frederick Jackson Turner, 1893.
Turner grows up in this little town in central Wisconsin called Portage, and he tells the story of that town as a kind of microcosm of this American melting pot that he thinks of as the frontier. You can't actually read the Turner Frontier essay in 1893 without seeing that what he's really doing is taking the story of Portage, Wisconsin, and mapping it onto the American map, so it becomes the story of all of America.
Turner is picking up on an idea that is very much around. A lot of people are commenting on it. The frontier is closed. The country's industrializing. The place of the greatest growth, quite obviously, is in the cities. We're now becoming a country of cities and of bigger cities. Immigrants are pouring in from Europe, and there's all this concern. What's happening to us? What are we becoming?
Where now could the seeds of liberty be planted? For Turner, the frontier meant social and economic freedom, and he worried that with its closing, America would become more like Europe. Turner believed in what is now called American exceptionalism.
His emphasis on the frontier was an emphasis on something which he thought of as unique to the United States, and therefore helping to explain why the United States was a more egalitarian society, why it was a more open society, why there was more social mobility in it, and this in turn affected the class structure. And that, made Turner a social scientist, if you will, or closer to the ways in which social scientists operate.
Turner is important not just for what he said about America, but for the way he told the story.
Turner really is one of the very first American historians who conceives of his intellectual activity as a social science. He really does think of history as a problem-solving activity, not a storytelling activity. And so he draws from all sorts of sciences, natural and social, that are going on around him. And maybe one of the biggest influences on Turner is geography. He's in love with maps, and the application of maps as statistical tools, as a way not just of depicting information, but of analyzing information, is the heart of what Turner is about.
There was more information to analyze than ever before, The 1890 census that so influenced Turner asked more questions than any other before that time or since. Measurement magnified the impact that the infant social sciences would have on American life. Data would be at the core of the first measured century.
Turner is one of a new group of historians that emerges at the end of the 19th century, early 20th century, who are vocal advocates for something that they call the new history. And that new history has a couple of characteristics. One is it is far more committed than any prior body of historical scholarship to social science analysis. It tries to use statistics. It uses the kind of data that historians had not used much up until that time in order to gain new insights and make new arguments. And then the other strand of the new history is those new insights, those new arguments, are pointed toward political interventions, very explicit political interventions, to say history can make a difference to policy. We can change the way we govern this country by using data in new ways.
Bella Boccia. So a new history based on data and social science was linked to politics from the very start. A social science controversy surfaced in a policy arena most Americans today would find antisocial and unscientific. For just as Turner was warning of the closing frontier, a new wave of immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe was coming into neighborhoods like this one, Little Italy, here in Baltimore. The immigrants brought their languages, their cultures, and their talents. But at the turn of the century, a school of thought now called scientific racism used the tools of social science to label the newcomers as unfit for self-government, unable to become real Americans, and in fact, biologically inferior. Here's how the field of play was set up at the time. In January of 1892, the government opened a special building on Ellis Island to handle the massive numbers of new arrivals to the United States. Throughout the early 1800s, immigration rose and fell with the famines and wars of Europe. But starting at about 1880, there began an extraordinary migration on a scale unheard of before or since. By 1930, more than 28 million people immigrated to the United States. That's on a base population of only 50 million people in 1880. Each year between 1905 and 1907, more than 1 million people entered the country. At the peak of immigration, almost 15% of the national population was foreign-born. In many cities, immigrants made up more than 50% of the population. The American economy was usually booming, and workers came from all across Europe, drawn by the promise of jobs and by something else.
The overwhelming number of immigrants who came to the United States in the late 19th and early 20th centuries were really in search of economic opportunity. But they were also concerned, and this was especially true of minority groups in parts of Southern and Eastern Europe, in political liberty. The ability to participate in the political system, to function in the world without the oppressiveness of a totalitarian regime. The pull of the United States and its attitude of religious liberty was very, very great.
Through the early 1800s, immigration to America had looked like this: primarily English, Scottish, German, and Scandinavian. But between 1880 and the 1920s, the flow changed. Eastern and Southern Europeans made the move to America in record numbers. Unlike the Scandinavian and German immigrant farmers of the 19th century, the new immigrants clustered in the cities. That's where the jobs were. Between 1880 and 1920, the cities expanded at a previously unimaginable pace. New York grew by more than 300%, Chicago 400%, Detroit 700%, and the real blockbusters were out west. Los Angeles grew by over 1,000% from a mere 50,000 people in 1890 to over 500,000 in just 30 years. These newcomers were often described by what they were not Protestant, not English-speaking, not skilled, not educated, and not liked. The newly arrived immigrants found themselves in a hostile and alien environment, in its way similar to the frontier described earlier by Frederick Jackson Turner.
For so many of these immigrants from Europe, they're coming from small cities or small towns, peasant villages, the shtetls of the Pale. They're hopscotching 2 or 3 centuries of history. Or, they're coming immediately into a strange new world.
Could the new immigrants adapt to life in America? Many learned men thought not, including Turner.
It is obvious that the replacement of the German and English immigration by Southern Italians, Poles, Russian Jews, and Slovaks is a loss to the social organism of the United States. The congestion of foreigners in localities in our great cities, the increase in crime and pauperism attributable to the poorer elements, all these are presented by this transformation of our immigration. Frederick Jackson Turner, 1901.
And Turner, it turned out, was a softy. Another prominent social scientist, Francis Walker, a superintendent of the census and later president of MIT, had this to say.
The entrance of such vast masses of peasantry, degraded below our utmost conceptions, is a matter which no intelligent patriot can look upon without the gravest apprehension and alarm. They are beaten men from beaten races. They have none of the ideas and aptitudes such as belong to those who are descended from the tribes that met under the oak trees of old Germany to make laws and choose chiefs. Francis Walker, 1896.
Good old democratic Germany.
We've come to think of race in this country almost entirely in the binary terms of black and white. But at the turn of the century, there were upwards of 36 in some schemes, 75 in other schemes, races. And the largest difference being the divisions within what we now think of as being one white race.
One scientist named William Ripley, believe it or not, identified a hierarchy of 3 fundamental white racial types in Europe by measuring head shape: the long-headed blonde Teutonic type, the short-headed brunette Alpine, and the long-headed dark Mediterranean, the Jews, Italians, Slavs, and Greeks. Surprised, the new immigrants from Eastern and Southern Europe were ranked at the bottom of the scale.
This was the age of science, and science in this time, social science as well as physical science, measuring everything from heads to leg length to nose size, was used to bolster discrimination.
Now, in the United States, there was an increasing attention to eugenics, the belief that you could improve the human condition and improve human stock by careful breeding.
Improving the American breeding stock was the goal of a Chicago biologist named Charles Davenport. In 1910, with a grant from, of all places, the Carnegie Foundation, he established the Eugenics Record Office.
The population of the United States will, on account of the great influx of blood from southeastern Europe, rapidly become darker in pigmentation, smaller in stature, more given to crimes of larceny, kidnapping, assault, murder, rape, and sex immorality. And the ratio of insanity in the population will rapidly increase. Charles Davenport, 1911.
For eugenicists like Davenport, race and character were fixed and immutable. Biology was destiny.
No matter how much philanthropy, no matter how much education, no matter how much learning and pulling oneself up by the bootstrap, they were confounded to some sort of state of inferiority.
Leading the opposition to this nativist view was a German Jewish immigrant who got his start in one of the coldest places on Earth. In 1883, a young scientist named Franz Boas traveled to Baffin Island in the Arctic Circle. While studying Eskimo customs, Boas began to develop one of the most important concepts in modern anthropology. At the time, tribal groups like the Eskimo were considered primitive and uncivilized. Northern European society was seen as the pinnacle of evolution, culturally, racially, and biologically. Boas wrote in his diary,
I often ask myself what advantages our good society possesses over the savages. The more I see of their customs, the more I realize that we have no right to look down on them. The idea of a cultured individual is merely relative.
In 1896, Franz Boas became one of the first professors of anthropology at Columbia University.
Franz Boas is affectionately known as the father of American anthropology. He has made a number of contributions. The first is delinking race from language and culture and making persuasive arguments that people and cultures do not go from savage, barbarian to civilized. Cultures are not better nor worse than any others. They're just equally complex and equally important on their own merits.
In 1907, Boas began an intensive study of close to 18,000 children of European immigrants. The results were published as Changes in Bodily Form, part of a 42-volume congressional study on immigration. Boas measured height, weight, head shape, and other physical traits, all cross-tabulated by whether his subjects were born in Europe or America, and how long they had lived in America. The results showed that in just one generation, the head shapes of children of long-skulled Nordic immigrants and those of the round-headed Slavic and Jewish immigrants were quickly becoming more like each other. In effect, once in an American environment eating an American diet, the children were physically becoming more like American children.
Boas was actually at a loss of words to really explain this, but he was demonstrating that the actual shape of people's bodies changed in the environment of the United States, which was actually quite profound.
And what that implies is that the hereditarians have it completely wrong. I mean, they're talking about immutable types. They're talking about unshakable characterology. They're talking about a kind of being, a racial being that's etched in stone that will never change. And he's saying, well, look right before your eyes, right here, among these throngs that you're so worried about here in the New World, we can see changes, and quite rapid ones at that.
Throughout his life, Boas continued to argue that environment played a key role in shaping individuals. But eugenicists turned to another way of sorting out the races. In the early 1900s, the American scientist H.H. Goddard was in the vanguard of those promoting the newly invented intelligence quotient, the IQ test. Goddard outlined a scale of feeble-minded intelligence. At the very bottom were the idiots, barely able to function. Next came imbeciles, mentally 4 to 10 years old and capable of only simple tasks. And Goddard added another stage, just on the edge of normal intelligence, the moron.
The thing that made morons, in Goddard's estimation, so important is that morons were thought to be functioning enough that they could actually enter society and take part in society. And they, as workers, as voters, and most importantly for Goddard, as procreators, as family members. They would be the mothers and fathers of the future generations of Americans.
In 1917, America entered the First World War. Millions of young men were mobilized to join the fight. Eugenicists saw an opportunity to gather a huge test sample. Lewis Terman of Stanford University convinced the Army that IQ tests could help sort the draftees according to their mental ability. Almost 2 million soldiers took the new tests. The written or alpha test included questions about American popular culture, the brand names of products, and even the location of a university. If the draftee failed the alpha test or was unable to read, he was given the verbal beta test. He had only a few minutes to look at pictures and draw in what was missing.
In looking at the intelligence tests, especially the verbal intelligence test, there was a tremendous cultural bias that was involved. Often an immigrant would be shown a picture of a tennis court and asked, "What's missing from this picture?" Well, if you were an Eastern European Jew fresh from the shtetl, you'd hardly be aware of the fact that there was a tennis net missing from the picture of the tennis court.
So scientific racism itself isn't new, but what is new in this period is the level of influence that science is having on policy debates and on policy itself.
Eugenicists seized on the Army IQ tests to prove to Congress that the races of Southern and Eastern Europe were a threat to the biological makeup of the nation. Henry Laughlin from the Eugenics Record Office testified before Congress that more than 75% of the new immigrants were feeble-minded. Based on such testimony, in 1924, Congress passed sweeping restrictions on immigration. The new law set quotas for incoming immigrants equal to 3% of the number of a given nationality living in America in 1890, 35 years earlier.
By going all the way back to 1890, it cut out from the calculations all of those millions who had arrived after 1890. What it does, in fact, is cut out exactly the people who eugenicists were the most afraid of. So while it's called a National Origins Act, it really is very much a Racial Origins Act.
Following the 1924 Act, immigration slowed way down until well after the Second World War. If many Americans didn't like immigrants, many immigrants did like America. Some, in fact, were ecstatic. In 1908, at the height of immigration, the most popular play on Broadway was called The Melting Pot. Written by Israel Zangwill, an immigrant playwright and political activist, it became a box office smash.
America is God's crucible, the great melting pot where all the races of Europe are melting and reforming. Here you stand, good folk, in your 50 groups with your 50 languages and histories, and your 50 blood hatreds and rivalries. A fig for your feuds and vendettas. Germans and Frenchmen, Irishmen and Englishmen, Jews and Russians, into the crucible with you all. God is making the American.
Zangwill knew what Franz Boas knew. In time, most immigrants become Americans. It has nothing to do with biology and everything to do with liberty. Okay, cue the babies. Smile, girls. Today, we take it for granted that kids like these will live to see their first birthday. But back in 1900, more than 1 of every 6 American infants, 1 in 6, died before the age of 1. And mothers were 100 times more likely to die in childbirth than they are today. Tuberculosis was the #1 cause of death for women. #2 was childbirth. In response to these frightening conditions, women activists rallied the nation to a campaign of reform. To make their case, they reached for the new tools of social science. We continue in Chicago, where in the shadow of the World's Fair, new immigrants were redrawing the face of the city. Between 1880 and 1900, the population of Chicago doubled and doubled again. The proportion of the city's residents who were foreign-born or first-generation American was 78%. Cheaply built tenements defined the landscape. Several families often crammed into a single apartment with little sanitation, ventilation, or sunlight. Disease often spread rapidly in the densely populated neighborhoods. The death of an infant from cholera, tuberculosis, and even simple diarrhea was a common fact of life. Horrified by the conditions in the city, small groups of university-educated women began volunteer organizations called settlement houses. These dormitory-like homes provided a place where middle and upper-class women could live and work in the heart of the poorest city neighborhoods.
The voluntary efforts were a way that women were encouraged to identify the city as their larger home. And it was a path into civic improvement and civic activity for women, because if they treated the city as a place that they were responsible for, they had to keep clean, they had to keep healthy for the benefit of their family members and the community as a family, that gave them opportunities for public actions that they didn't ordinarily have.
One of the first and most important of these settlement groups was Hull House in Chicago. It was founded in 1889 by the 29-year-old daughter of abolitionists, Jane Addams.
The streets are inexpressibly dirty. The number of schools inadequate. Sanitary legislation unenforced. Hundreds of houses are unconnected with the street sewer. The older and richer inhabitants seem anxious to move away as rapidly as they can afford it. They make room for newly arrived immigrants who are densely ignorant of civic duty. Jane Addams, 1891.
For the next 45 years, Addams led Hull House in aiding and educating their immigrant neighbors. One young boy who took his first music lessons at the settlement house was the son of a poor Jewish tailor, Benny Goodman. In 1893, Hull House was hired by the Illinois Bureau of Labor to gather statistics on wages. The women canvassed the entire neighborhood, door to door, with a detailed survey. The collected data formed the basis of a landmark book, Hull House Maps and Papers, published in 1895. Using detailed, color-coded maps, the volume breathed life into dry statistics.
And the map showed you, for any building, the wages of the residents in that building, and then another map showed you the nationalities of the people in that building. So you could look and see block by block, even building by building, where wages were falling out and which nationalities were stacked next to each other in this ward.
The nationalities map showed 18 different ethnic groups in the one-third square mile neighborhood around Hull House. Italian families, marked in blue, clustered to the north, and Poles and Russian Jews, noted in red, lived to the south. The neighborhood even had its own red light district. The lots in white indicated brothels, most of which were occupied by native-born women, both white and black, not by immigrants. The wage map showed the average income in the area was only about $7 a week. That's like a family at the end of the 20th century living on about $7,000 a year. The lots in black show that most Italians made less than $5 a week and were unemployed much of the year.
And one of the things that the women at Hull House were very anxious to demonstrate was that the people in their neighborhood were not vicious, that they were not drunken, lazy bums, but were impoverished because of low wages, because of the conditions in which they worked.
They thought that poverty was not a result of sin, but rather a result of social conditions, and that it was society's responsibility to address poverty, both the living conditions and health and welfare.
Hull House Maps and Papers used data to make a case for political action. Social measurement helped turn an emotional plea into a focused argument for reform.
They don't care that people should use that information to spin theories, sociological theories. They're not interested in theories. They're interested in solving social problems. And so women social scientists were continuing a tradition of sociology, of economics, of political science, of social science in general, outside of universities. And that stream of social science thought, that stream of social science practice, continued to marry moral imperatives to the collection of data.
But according to some social scientists, this was not a marriage made in heaven. They said that if the new disciplines were to grow and remain credible, morality and emotion had to take a backseat to science. It was the president of the American Sociological Society who made the most passionate case against passion.
Thinking must be freed from the bias of emotion. There must be eliminated all the associations that disturb the connection between the thinking and the data. William Fielding Ogburn.
Ogburn had refined his views while teaching at the two institutions that led the way in the new field of American sociology, Columbia University and then the University of Chicago, just a stone's throw away from Hull House, at which he occasionally threw stones.
Desire has a strong selective influence in causing particular data to be noted and other data not to be noted. Theories suggested by such facts have a strong probability of being untrue in varying degrees, offering false solutions.
But for Jane Addams and the women activists, collecting data was more than just an academic exercise. Women did not have the national right to vote. Numbers were a source of power. Armed with statistics, women's groups mobilized across the country.
There were millions, literally millions of women involved in progressive reform activities in the early 20th century. Women not only in the settlement movement, but women in organizations like the General Federation of Women's Clubs, in the Women's Christian Temperance Union, the Daughters of the American Revolution, some groups that we much later would associate with conservatism, not progressivism, were in the early 20th century very much a part, in fact central, to progressive reforms.
And in 1912, Congress created the Children's Bureau under the Department of Labor. Jane Addams and her network of women's groups persuaded President William Howard Taft to appoint a woman as chief of the Bureau. Julia Lathrop became the first woman to head a federal agency. One of the original residents of Hull House and a co-author of Maps and Papers, Lathrop firmly believed in the power of data.
We do not know how many children are born each year, or how many die, or why they die. We need statistics of nativity and mortality. Homeless and neglected children are going to be better cared for, because we're going to do more for all children as we begin to know more about the problems of childhood in general. Julia Lathrop, 1912.
The Children's Bureau studies revealed that infant death was often caused by unsanitary conditions, contaminated water, and by the lack of adequate health care. In homes without running water, infant deaths were 40% higher. And as the father's income fell by half, infant mortality doubled. Lathrop searched for an approach that would be both helpful and politically feasible.
She decides that the education of pregnant women and new mothers would be one of the ways that she might help to decrease infant and maternal mortality. So she mounts an educational campaign to help women learn about the value of prenatal care, for instance, about the kinds of nutrition that pregnant women need to have, the kinds of exercise that they need to have in order to have a healthy delivery. And she mounts an educational campaign about the healthiest ways to raise babies.
Lathrop rallied her grassroots network to lobby for an expansion of the Children's Bureau. And in 1920, Congress passed the Shepard-Towner Maternity and Infancy Act. It would become a model for much of the social welfare legislation of the 20th century. Itinerant nurses sought out pregnant women and new mothers, setting up wellness tents, examining babies, and educating their mothers. Women's groups spread the gospel of cleanliness, proper feeding habits, and the need to seek out a doctor or clinic for advice. Women's club members went door to door to measure infant births and deaths, and then compared the results to local records. They showed that infant mortality had previously been greatly underestimated.
One of the remarkable things about Julia Lathrop's procedure was the degree to which she involved women in local organizations. She was creating a demand for the collection of statistics. She was involving grassroots people who had no training themselves in academic social science in the collection of social data, and so was giving that method a kind of authority in American life that it simply had not previously had.
Social science measurement passed the test of political power. It worked. We can now look back and see what happened over the century. In 1900, for every 1,000 births, 165 babies died. By 1930, that rate had dropped by more than half, and it kept going down. By the end of the century, only 7 babies died for every 1,000 born. Over the course of the century, life expectancy at birth increased from 47 years to 76 years. A baby born at the end of the century will typically live 50% longer than an infant born in 1900. A similar trend was apparent among new mothers. In 1900, for every 100,000 births, about 850 mothers died from problems related to pregnancy and childbirth. Today, for every 100,000 births, there are 8 deaths.